Hey, David Ralphoff here. I was recently getting a bunch of questions about this Unity project for doing dialogue and having dialogue choices, and I just thought I'd go through and do like a little tour of the project here because I probably didn't do a good enough job making it clear how some of these pieces fit together, and I'm seeing a lot of questions about it. So I'm just gonna do I'm gonna like quickly touch on some of the common questions I've been getting, but in order to answer them, I'm gonna kind of start with the data again. So the way this project works, I'll just run it here for a second. So if I hit spacebar, the characters are going to talk to each other, and then basically these questions will pop up, and these questions will each have choices, and each choice has another conversation tied to it. And as we click on that, it's going to trigger whatever that next conversation is, and I think it'll just keep looping. I can't remember, or I guess it just ends. So I just wanted to step through some of the pieces of that. So I'm using these things called scriptable objects. So here I'm looking at a question on the left, who will you fight? And it has an array of choices over here of size 3. We could add more and you'd get more. But the text for each choice is going to appear under each of these array items. So here it's evil Ryu, and then the conversation to load is this other scriptable object, which is a different conversation. And those conversations are over here, but it's not really important. It's just each of these choices has a conversation tied to it. And the way all this gets pieced together is there's already in the scene here, there's a conversation object, and it has a left speaker and a right speaker. And those are the things that will present the conversation. So when Chun-Li was on the left and Ryu was on the right, that's kind of what was the UI for that. And then there's this question that's also in the middle, and that's representing that little question dialogue that popped up with the question at the top and then the 3 choices. And then the way the question works is there's a game object here for a choice button within it. So there's choice buttons and then choice button, like a singular one. And this basically is just used as a template by the scripts. So it's just going to clone this choice button for every choice that's available in the question. So that would be for this question, it's going to generate a choice button for evil Ryu, for Akuma, and for Guile over here. And clicking any of those buttons should cause whatever the related conversation is here to load. But I think where people were getting tripped up was the references to the scriptable objects, the references to the game objects, and then how the events all tied into that. So that's what I'm going to try and cover here. So here on conversation, you can see it's showing this little question event over here, and I'll show you the related script to this in a second. But it's essentially looking for a question event. So I'm going to pull this out a little bit. And then if you use these little pluses down here, you can add things that you want to do when that event comes in. I'm just going to remove the one that I added here. I just wanted to show you that you can do that. But basically, this conversation object has a conversation controller script, and it can listen to this question event. And in order for this to do anything, you have to give it another game object here. So if you look on the left there, when I click on this, it's highlighting that it knows about this question game object. So if you don't have this set up, you could just drag that game object over here. And then what it's going to do is give you the option here to look at the controller, to look at a number of things on that game object, but one of them should be the related question controller. And you can just tell it that you want it to trigger this change. And I'll show you the code that's related to this in a second. So yeah, just to kind of revisit. So we're on the conversation game object. It has a conversation controller. It also has a conversation here, you can see. And then it's able to respond to question events, but it needs a game object and a related piece of functionality to call. So let's take a look at conversation controller. And you'll notice one thing I'm doing up here is defining a question event. And it expects this to be of like type Unity event question. Then down here, I'm setting up the public instance of this, which is question event. And the combination of having that and this is going to allow us to update this in the editor. And then we can just look in the code here for question event. And we can see here when we're trying to advance the conversation, if the conversation has a question, so it's not null, we can call question invoke, and we'll give it the conversation's question. So if we were to hop back, we can see essentially what we're doing here is we're going to invoke this question event with a question, and that's going to cause question controller dot change to get called. So if we hop over to question controller, you can see there's a change method here, and that takes a question. So when the question controller gets a new question, it's going to remove all the old choices. It's going to set the current question to be whatever was passed in. It's going to make the game object for question or whatever this controller is attached to active. And then it's going to just do some initialization. And that initialization is mostly about setting the, like printing out the text from the question and then creating each question choice from the template, from the game object templates. And then it's just holding on to references to the controllers for each of those. And in order to add a choice button, there's just a method here that takes the choice button and the relevant choice on the question based on where we are in the loop, and then just the index of where we are in the loop. And so that's how all those pieces get tied together. And there's a similar setup if we look here at question. So on the question game object over here, sorry, I'm going to go down a bit. It's on the choice button underneath question. So this is a generic template for a choice button, and it's what we were just using in that loop to generate a choice button for each choice that is on a question. And you'll notice it has a conversation, it's watching for a conversation change event, and it's expecting a type conversation. And when it gets it, it's gonna do two different updates. So you can see here, when I click on this, there's a reference to this conversation game object over on the left. Sorry, I double clicked on that. So when we get a conversation change event on this choice button, it's going to reference that game object, and it's going to call this method here, conversation controller.change conversation, which makes sense because each choice you make in the conversation should advance the conversation to something else. And you can see here, that's what's selected. And then similarly, when that conversation change event comes in from choice button, we're also keeping a reference to the overall question UI. And we're going to call question controller.hide. And it makes sense if you think about it. So we're selecting a answer to a question. And at that point, we want to hide the question and advance the conversation or change the conversation, which is what's happening above. And I'll just show you what that looks like as well in the code. So if we hop over to choice controller, we'll have a similar setup. So here at the top, you can see we're setting up a conversation change event that's going to be of type Unity event conversation. And then again here, we're setting up a public instance variable that is a conversation change event. And then we should see this invoked below. Sorry, wrong search term. Let's try that again. So when this initially runs, if there is no conversation change event, this is going to set it up for us so that we have one available. And then down here on make choice, we're going to call conversation change event.invoke, and we're going to look at the conversation that's part of the choice scriptable object. And we're going to emit this conversation change event with that conversation. And if you remember over here, we're waiting for a conversation change event. So we'll get that conversation that we're trying to switch to. And it's going to just say, hey, on the conversation game object, call its controller's change conversation method. And then also on the parent question game object here, that's basically the whole UI for the question and the choices, just go ahead and call question controller.hide. So through using these events, we can invoke an event, basically cause the event to happen, and then we can just, through this inspector on the right, we can track all the game objects that will be interested in that and specify what we want to happen with those, like which method we want to call. And those will just get called with the conversation. And we can just take a look at that. So if we looked at like question controller, we should see a hide method that takes a conversation. So in question controller, we have a hide method here, and it takes a conversation, and it just removes choices related to that, and goes ahead and sets game object to active false. So that's gonna hide that, and then we'll see the same thing if we look at conversation controller change conversation. So this again is taking a conversation, and the semantics here are that this is the next conversation. So it's going to say that conversation is not yet started. So it's going to set to false. And then it's going to set up the current conversation to be this next conversation that we just passed in. And then it's just going to go ahead and advance to the first line of that conversation. So yeah, hopefully that helps show how all these pieces fit together, how you create one of these events, how you set up things to update based on these events happening, and then how you actually like invoke an event with the relevant object so that the listeners can do whatever they need to do. And yeah, if you have any other questions about how this works, how it's set up, I'd definitely be interested to hear about those. I guess quickly too, before I close this out, because I got a question about this, I'll show that also on this choice button here. It has a handler for on click, and it's a similar setup. So this button, I guess it's targeting. Looks like it's targeting itself, I guess. So when it gets a click, it's going to call choice controller dot make choice. And down here, it's going to do conversation event dot invoke choice dot conversation, and the choice is coming from up here. So basically, whatever the choice is, it's just going to advance to its conversation. And yeah, I think that's about it. I think that this is a sorry, just taking a look at this real quick here. So it looks like you need the button script in order to make that work. But yeah, that's how you would trigger that. And just to go back to kind of close the loop on that too, if you remember the scriptable objects, there is going to be a question. So here's an example when I've got just this question over here. And the question has an array of choices. And for each of those choices, there's text and a conversation. So when you think about this button script, and here it's the onClick's targeting itself, it's going to call its controller.makeChoice. And part of setting up that button is specifying its choice. So it should have a choice. So when we call make choice, it's going to look at the conversation related to that choice. And yeah, just to go back to it too, like here's where all those choices are being generated. So here's a for loop that essentially takes the question, pulls off its text, and for each choice that's part of that question, it's just adding choice button through a choice controller here and just holding on to those choice controllers. We could take a look at add button, I guess. So yeah, add choice button. It takes that template, it takes a choice, and it takes an index, and then it just basically instantiates the button. It sets a bunch of properties on it, like what its parents are and some positioning, what the name of the button is, the fact that it's active. Then it grabs the choice controller off of that, sets the choice with the one that was passed in, and then returns that to choice controller. So as each of these buttons is created, it's returning the choice controller, and that's what gets you. That's what we're holding on to over here. So I hope that connects the dots. If you still have questions, just leave me a comment on this video. Yeah, thanks for watching, and hopefully that helps clear up some of these questions. Appreciate that. Later.